You know how sometimes you think you know someone completely, and then one moment changes everything? That's exactly what happened to me. I'm Sophia Bennett, and I'm sitting here 3 months later, still trying to make sense of how my 15-year marriage imploded in a single conversation. Let me start from the beginning, because the ending only makes sense if you understand how we got there. Grant and I met in 1998. I was 26 and he was 31. Steady job in marketing, already owned his own place. Looking back, maybe I should have noticed how he always seemed to have his life figured out while I was still finding my footing. But in those early days, his stability felt like exactly what I needed. He was the kind of man who remembered to change the oil in his car, who had a retirement account before he turned 30, who never forgot an anniversary. My friends called him husband material, and I felt lucky. We had this ritual during our first year of dating where we'd stay up late talking about everything. Our childhoods, our fears, our dreams. One night, curled up on his couch with takeout containers scattered around us, we got into this deep conversation about trust and honesty in relationships. I think the worst thing you can do to someone you love is lie to them, Grant said, tracing patterns on my arm. Even if the truth hurts, even if it changes things, I'd rather know who I'm really with than live with someone wearing a mask. I remember feeling this rush of warmth, thinking I'd found someone who really understood what love should be. What if someone made a terrible mistake, I asked. What if they'd done something awful, but they'd changed? Then they should trust me enough to tell me, he said, without hesitation. I can't promise I wouldn't be hurt, but I'd rather have an honest partner than a perfect stranger. That conversation became the foundation of what I thought was unshakable trust between us. For years afterward, whenever something difficult came up, I'd reference it. When I accidentally dented his car and was terrified to tell him. When I got fired from a client project for missing a deadline. When my sister asked me to lie about her drinking problem. Every time, Grant would remind me of that night and say, "We tell each other everything, Soph. That's what makes us work." We got married in 2001, bought a house in 2003, and settled into what felt like a good life. Grant's marketing career took off, and my design business grew slowly but steadily. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We talked about kids someday, traveled when we could afford it, and built the kind of relationship that looked solid from the outside. But if I'm being honest, and what's the point of telling this story if I'm not, there were cracks I chose not to see. Grant had this way of making decisions for both of us and presenting them as suggestions. He'd say things like, "Don't you think it would be better if..." Or, "I was thinking we should..." But somehow I always ended up doing what he thought was best. He was never mean about it, never raised his voice or gave ultimatums. He was just so logical, so reasonable, that arguing with him felt like arguing with math. When I wanted to take a risk with a bigger client, he'd list all the ways it could go wrong until I talked myself out of it. When I suggested we move to a neighborhood with more character, he'd pull up crime statistics and property values until I agreed our current place was better. I told myself this was what healthy relationships looked like. Two people making smart decisions together. I told myself I was lucky to have someone who thought things through so carefully. Here's the thing I never told him. The thing that ate at me for years. I wasn't who he thought I was. Before we met, before I became the responsible woman he fell in love with, I had a completely different life. From 18 to 24, I was a mess. Not the cute, quirky kind of mess that makes for good stories, the real kind that leaves scars. I dropped out of college after my sophomore year and spent the next few years bouncing between jobs, relationships, and cities. I was angry about my parents' divorce, angry about feeling abandoned, angry at the world in general. I drank too much, made terrible choices with men, and burned through friendships like they were disposable. The worst of it happened when I was 23. I was living in Portland with this guy, Mitchell, who dealt drugs. Not hardcore stuff, just marijuana mostly. But it was still illegal, and I was helping him. I convinced myself it wasn't that serious. We were just helping people relax, right? We weren't hurting anyone. Except we were. One night, Mitchell asked me to deliver a package to someone across town. I knew what it was, but by then I was so deep in denial about what my life had become that I just went along with it. The buyer was this kid, couldn't have been more than 17. And when I saw him, I felt something crack inside me. I gave him the package anyway. 3 days later, that kid was in the hospital after mixing what he'd bought with alcohol and prescription pills. He didn't die, thank God, but he came close enough that I spent that entire night in my car outside the hospital, crying and throwing up and wondering how I'd become someone I didn't recognize. That was my wake-up call. I left Portland the next week, cut ties with Mitchell and everyone else from that life, and spent the next 2 years getting my act together. I went to therapy, got clean, started building the life that eventually led me to Grant, but I never told him any of it. In the beginning, it felt too fresh, too shameful. I was afraid he'd see me differently, afraid he'd leave. As time went on, it became harder to bring up. How do you tell someone you've been living with for years that you used to be someone completely different? How do you explain that you've been carrying this secret that feels like it belongs to another person? I told myself it didn't matter because I wasn't that person anymore. I told myself the past was the past, and what mattered was who I'd become. I almost convinced myself it was true. The secret might have stayed buried forever if my past hadn't come knocking. Last October, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said, "Is this Sophia?" Sophia, who used to live on Morrison Street in Portland. My blood went cold. Nobody from my current life knew about Morrison Street. The woman introduced herself as Karen, Mitchell's sister. She told me Mitchell had died 2 months earlier, overdose. She was going through his things and found some old letters I'd written him. She wanted to return them. I should have just given her my address and left it at that. But something about her voice, about the fact that Mitchell was dead, made me need to know more. I agreed to meet her for coffee. Karen turned out to be nothing like her brother. Clean, responsible, a social worker who'd spent years trying to get Mitchell into rehab. She'd known about our relationship, knew about the dealing, and she didn't judge me for it. She said she was just glad I'd gotten out. "He talked about you sometimes," she said, stirring her coffee absently, especially toward the end. "He said you were the only one who had the sense to leave." We talked for 2 hours. She told me about Mitchell's struggles, about his failed attempts to get clean, about the way addiction had slowly consumed everything good in him. She told me about the kid, Danny, the one who'd overdosed that night. He'd gotten help, gone to college, was doing well now, but she also told me there had been others over the years, kids who hadn't been so lucky. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," Karen said, "but I thought you should know that what you two were doing, it had consequences. Real ones." I drove home in a daze, those letters sitting in my passenger seat like a time bomb. Grant was in his home office when I got back, working late as usual. I stood in the doorway for 10 minutes, just watching him type, wondering how to begin a conversation that would change everything. I didn't tell him that night, or the next. I hid the letters in my art supplies, where I knew he'd never look, and tried to pretend the meeting with Karen had never happened, but it was too late. The secret that had been manageable when it was abstract became impossible to carry once it had a name, a face, consequences I couldn't ignore. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd catch myself staring off into space during conversations. Grant noticed something was wrong, but when he asked, I'd just say I was stressed about work. It all came to a head 3 weeks later on a Saturday morning in November. Grant was making pancakes, our weekend tradition, and chatting about plans for Thanksgiving. Normal, comfortable, domestic. The kind of moment that should have been perfect but felt like torture because I was keeping this enormous secret from the person who was supposed to know me better than anyone. "You've been quiet lately," he said, not looking up from the stove. "Everything okay?" I opened my mouth to give him the usual reassurance, but what came out instead was, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago." He turned around then, spatula still in hand, and I saw the concern on his face shift to something more serious. He could hear it in my voice. This wasn't going to be a small confession. We sat down at the kitchen table, pancakes forgotten, And I told him everything. About Portland, about Mitchell, about the dealing and the kid who'd almost died and how I'd been carrying this secret for 15 years. I told him about Karen's call and the letters and how I'd been falling apart for weeks trying to figure out how to tell him. I was crying by the end of it, not the pretty kind of crying, but the ugly, choking kind that comes from years of held-back shame. I kept saying I was sorry, that I should have told him sooner, that I understood if he needed time to process it all. Grant listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he sat there for a long moment, just looking at me like he was seeing a stranger. "You sold drugs," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I helped someone who sold drugs," I said. "I know it's the same thing, but you helped put a kid in the hospital." "I didn't know, but you knew what you were doing was wrong." His voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact. "You knew it was illegal and potentially dangerous, and you did it anyway." I nodded, because what else could I do? He was right. "And then you lied to me about it for 15 years. "I didn't lie," I said weakly. "I just didn't tell you." Grant laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sophia, I asked you directly when we first started dating if you'd ever done anything illegal. You said no." He was right about that too. I'd forgotten about that specific conversation, but he was right. "I was different then," I said. "I was ashamed. I was afraid you'd leave if you knew." "So you decided to lie." "I decided to be the person you deserved," I said, and I meant it. I changed, Grant. Everything about me changed. I'm not that person anymore. "But you were that person," he said. "For 6 years of your adult life, you were that person. And then you spent 15 years pretending it never happened." What happened next wasn't what I expected. I'd prepared myself for anger, for disappointment, for a long, difficult conversation about trust and forgiveness. I thought about that night early in our relationship when he'd said he'd rather have an honest partner than live with a stranger. I'd hoped that honesty, even coming this late, would matter to him. Instead, Grant just shut down. He didn't yell or storm out or demand a separation. He thanked me for telling him, said he needed some time to think, and went for a walk. When he came back 2 hours later, he was polite but distant. We ate dinner together, watched TV, went to bed at our usual times, but it was like sleeping next to a stranger. The next few days were worse than fighting would have been. Grant was functional, present, but completely unavailable emotionally. He'd answer direct questions, but didn't initiate conversation. He'd go through the motions of our normal routine, but without any of the warmth or connection that usually accompanied it. When I tried to bring up the conversation, to ask how he was feeling, what he was thinking, whether we could work through this, he'd give me these measured responses that said nothing. "I'm still processing. I need more time. This isn't something I can just get over quickly." I understood that. I really did. What I didn't understand was the complete emotional withdrawal. This was the man who'd held me while I cried over every disappointment, who'd stayed up all night with me when my father had his heart attack, who'd told me that honesty was the foundation of everything. Now that I'd finally been completely honest with him, he was treating me like a roommate he barely tolerated. 2 weeks after my confession, I started having chest pains. Not dramatic, Hollywood heart attack stuff. Just this persistent ache and tightness that got worse when I was stressed, which, given the state of my marriage, was most of the time. I made an appointment with our family doctor, thinking it was probably just anxiety. Dr. Martinez ran some tests and told me it was likely stress-related, but she wanted to do an EKG just to be safe. She also noticed that my blood pressure was elevated and asked about changes in my life recently. I found myself telling her about the situation with Gran. Not the details about my past, just that we were having marital problems, and I was worried about how it was affecting my health. "Are you getting support at home?" she asked. "Someone to talk to about this stress." I almost laughed. Support at home. The person who was supposed to be my support system was the source of the stress. The EKG came back normal, which was a relief. But Dr. Martinez prescribed some medication for my blood pressure and strongly recommended that I find someone to talk to. A therapist, a close friend. anyone who could help me process what I was going through. When I got home that afternoon, Grant was in the kitchen making dinner. I told him about the appointment, about the chest pains, and the blood pressure medication. "I'm glad you're okay," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. But he didn't ask follow-up questions. He didn't offer to come with me to the next appointment. He didn't even look particularly concerned. That night, lying in bed next to him, I realized something that chilled me more than the chest pains had. He was done with me. Not just angry or disappointed, done. He was going through the motions of being my husband while mentally and emotionally checking out of our marriage. The breaking point came a week later on a Sunday evening in December. I was in my home studio, working on a project that was due Monday morning. It was a big client, the kind that could lead to more work, and I'd been putting the finishing touches on a logo design. I was stressed about the deadline, stressed about my marriage, and probably hadn't eaten enough that day. I don't remember exactly what happened next. One minute I was adjusting colors on my computer screen, and the next I was on the floor. When I came to, my head was throbbing, and there was blood on my hand from where I'd hit the corner of my desk on the way down. I called for Grant, but he didn't answer. I could hear the TV from the living room, so I knew he was home. I called again, louder this time, and finally heard his footsteps on the stairs. "What happened?" he asked when he saw me sitting on the floor, holding a tissue to my bleeding hand. "I think I fainted," I said. "I hit my head on the desk." He helped me up and looked at the cut on my hand. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding steadily. My head felt like it was full of cotton, and I was dizzy when I stood. "Should we go to the emergency room?" I asked. Grant looked at me for a moment, and I could see him calculating. "It's probably just stress," he said. "The cut isn't that bad. Why don't you clean it up and see how you feel?" I stared at him. I just fainted and hit my head, and he was suggesting I clean myself up and see how I felt. "Grant, I lost consciousness," I said. "What if it's something serious?" "You've been under a lot of stress," he said. "You probably just forgot to eat today, didn't you?" He was right, I had forgotten to eat, but the casual way he dismissed my concern made something snap inside me. "Will you come with me?" I asked. "To the ER? I don't think I should drive." Grant looked at his watch. It was 8:30 p.m. "There's going to be a long wait," he said, "and I have an early meeting tomorrow." I couldn't believe what I was hearing.